What if I told you there are graves in Charleston that were never meant to be opened? Graves that hold not the bones of the enslaved, but the living breath of those who enslaved them. Whispers speak of 9 men, masters of human flesh, who vanished without a trace. No records, no funerals, no bodies, and the question that no one dared to ask still lingers in the damp Carolina soil. What happens when the enslaved decide that the ground itself will swallow their masters whole? This is not just history, it's a secret Charleston has buried for over 2 centuries. And if it's true, then every plantation ledger, every monument, every smiling portrait of the South's proud elite is a lie. Because one man, a slave named Solomon, may have rewritten justice with dirt, with darkness, with silence. Why was this buried? Why were those who whispered it silenced? And if we dare to uncover it, what else has been erased? Charleston in the early 1800s was not simply a city. It was an artery pulsing with the lifeblood of an empire built on human suffering. Walk its narrow streets then, and you would hear the clatter of carriage wheels over cobblestones, the creak of wooden ships drifting into harbor, and the steady rhythm of chains striking against one another. The air itself carried the memory of salt water, of sweat, of blood. It was a city where wealth grew so tall it cast shadows over the misery that built it, and where the very soil seemed to whisper stories that polite society pretended not to hear. Charleston was America's grand facade of prosperity, but behind its elegant balconies and fragrant gardens lay the harshest truth of all. This was the single most important gateway through which human lives were funneled into bondage. Nearly half of all Africans brought to North America passed through this city. That staggering number is not just statistics on a page. It meant that for generations, Charleston was the point of no return, the place where names were erased and replaced with prices, where lives were inventoried like furniture, and where families were dissolved with the cold stroke of a pen. Ships came in heavy with bodies packed like cargo, the stench of disease and despair rising into the harbor breeze. Yet when the doors of the slave pens opened, the planters saw only profit. The markets bustled with wealthy men who spoke of liberty by day and spent their nights calculating the value of human flesh. On one side of town, aristocrats gathered in candlelit drawing rooms to discuss politics and philosophy. On the other, auctioneers raised their voices to shout out bids for children no older than 5, for women who had already borne too many children, for men whose backs carried scars that spoke louder than their mouths ever could. Charleston's power rested not just in its economy, but in its identity. The city presented itself as cultured, refined, steeped in tradition and Southern grace. It built theaters, churches, and universities, and dressed its brutality in lace and politeness. Visitors from Europe often marveled at its beauty, never realizing that behind the manicured facades of grand houses, the enslaved worked from dawn until long past dusk. These men and women tended to the gardens whose blossoms strangers admired, scrubbed the floors where silk dresses swept, and served meals at tables where the masters spoke of God, honor, and civilization. The contradictions were grotesque but normalized. The South's pride was constructed atop layers of silent terror, yet beneath this careful order, an unspoken truth hummed in every field and alley. Those enslaved were not blind to the hypocrisy that ruled over them. They saw that Charleston was built on their blood, their skill, their endurance. They heard the masters boast of their refined taste while whipping a boy until he collapsed. They watched the wealth of the city expand while their own lives shrank into cycles of work, hunger, and grief. And they remembered. Memory was its own form of resistance. For the Africans newly arrived, traditions, songs, and stories smuggled within their hearts became weapons against despair. For those born on Carolina soil, whispered tales of uprisings and escape carried through the quarters like smoke. Faint but undeniable. The scale of Charleston's cruelty bred an atmosphere of fear, not only among the enslaved, but among the masters themselves. For every wealthy family whose fortune was bound to rice fields and cotton, there lingered the quiet dread that their wealth could become their grave. They lived surrounded by people they called property, but who outnumbered them in body and in spirit. Rumors of insurrection sent ripples through the city again and again. The Haitian Revolution, though thousands of miles away, was a constant ghost in Charleston's parlors. Planters drank their wine and spoke of profits, but their ears were always alert for the faintest whisper of rebellion. They created laws to smother even the possibility of resistance. Bans on teaching slaves to read, restrictions on movement, harsh curfews, and brutal punishments for the smallest disobedience. Still, no law could erase the truth that their entire system balanced precariously on the submission of people who had every reason to rise. Charleston's geography amplified this precariousness. The city sat low, surrounded by marshlands and rice plantations, where enslaved laborers endured some of the harshest conditions in America. Mosquitoes carried death in swarms, rice fields swallowed men in mud, and the relentless sun beat down until skin blistered. Masters rarely visited these fields themselves. Instead, overseers ensured the work never ceased. But for the enslaved, the land itself became a map of possibility. The swamps offered hiding places. The dense forests offered paths for escape. Even the soil beneath their feet was studied, remembered, and understood in ways no master ever cared to notice. To the planters, the land was profit. To the enslaved, it could be either a prison or a weapon. The culture of Charleston thrived on silence. Official records celebrated wealth, marriages, inheritances, and architecture. They wrote endlessly of trade and political debates, yet the daily violence of slavery remained between the lines, deliberately unrecorded. The city's elite knew that history was written by those in power, and so they ensured that the most grotesque realities were hidden behind polite words. Auctions became transactions, chains were restraints, torture was discipline, and those who died from exhaustion or punishment simply vanished from ledgers. This silence was not ignorance. It was strategy. By burying the truth beneath layers of euphemism, Charleston ensured that outsiders saw only its surface, the charm, the civility, the wealth, while the truth rotted beneath. But silence has cracks. Stories, especially forbidden ones, have ways of surviving. Enslaved men and women carried their truths not in documents but in memory, in whispers, in songs that encoded meanings white ears could not decipher. Around fires late at night in quarters where no master set foot, fragments of history were preserved. They spoke of brutal overseers, of betrayals and small victories, of men and women who dared to strike back. And they spoke of Charleston itself, not as a proud city, but as a place of unending sorrow, a place whose beauty was a mask for cruelty. These whispers carried more power than the planters realized. They kept alive the notion that even in the darkest cages, justice could be imagined, plotted, perhaps even achieved. To understand Solomon's legend, one must first understand this Charleston, a city of wealth and fear, of cruelty and silence. It was a place where the enslaved saw the contradictions clearer than anyone, where every day reminded them of the injustice that defined their lives. For those who suffered beneath its elegant facades, Charleston was not the cradle of Southern charm. It was the heart of a nightmare that demanded to be remembered, even if only in secret. It was this soil, drenched in both blood and silence, that became the stage for whispers of a revenge so unthinkable that history itself tried to erase it. They called him Solomon, though whether that was the name his mother gave him or the one forced on him when he was bought, no one could say for certain. Names were often stripped, replaced with the cold convenience of a master's whim, but somehow this one lingered. It carried a weight, a resonance, as though it clung to him despite every attempt to erase his origin. Those who knew him in passing whispered that he was not like the others. He had a gaze that unsettled, a silence that seemed to carry more than words, and a mind that recorded everything. In Charleston, where the enslaved were expected to bow their heads and keep their eyes fixed on the ground, Solomon looked differently. He did not stare with open defiance. Such a thing would have brought instant punishment, but there was something measured in the way his eyes moved. He observed always as though every cruelty committed around him was being inscribed in some invisible book only he could see. His early life was shrouded in mystery. Some said he had crossed the Atlantic in chains, a boy whose childhood was torn from him the moment the ship's hull swallowed him. Others claimed he was Carolina-born, raised under the lash and the sweltering sun of the rice fields. Both accounts carried fragments of truth, but neither could capture the whole of him. What was undeniable was his endurance. Many men broken under the cruelty of one master seldom lived to serve another, yet Solomon had been passed through the hands of 9. Each time he was sold, it was as though fate conspired to place him in the path of those whose brutality would later become the heart of his story. It was whispered that he carried scars from all 9, that his back was a living map of Charleston's cruelty. and that each welt and burn marked not only suffering, but a vow silently sworn. Solomon's intelligence was a danger. Masters noticed it, sometimes with unease. He carried out tasks not just with obedience, but with an efficiency that suggested planning, foresight, an understanding of systems beyond what he was ever taught. He repaired tools when others would discard them. He studied the workings of barns and granaries. He understood the land with an intimacy born not only of toil but of curiosity. He saw the patterns of the tides, the flow of water through the marshes, the firmness of soil in some places and the treachery of it in others. This was knowledge his masters ignored, too preoccupied with their profits to notice how the very earth shifted beneath their wealth. But Solomon noticed, and more importantly, he remembered. Among the enslaved, he earned a quiet respect. Not because he shouted or fought openly, but because he listened. In the evenings, when others collapsed into exhausted silence, he would sit close to the old ones who still carried fragments of Africa in their stories. He learned of spirits that guarded the land, of ancestors who punished injustice, of revenge woven not in haste but in patience. These stories did not fade in him. They took root. And in the rhythms of the rice fields, in the endless repetition of suffering, those roots grew deeper. He began to embody something the others recognized, patience sharpened into resolve. While others prayed for survival, Solomon seemed to be waiting for something else, something larger. His masters could never understand this. To them he was a body, a tool, a number in a ledger. If he seemed quieter than others, they called it obedience. If he performed his tasks well, they called it usefulness. If he endured beatings without breaking, they mistook it for submission. They did not see the intelligence shaping itself behind his eyes. They did not recognize that in the silence where they thought nothing lived, something far more dangerous was forming. Solomon understood the unique cruelty of each man who owned him, and he carried their names, their habits, their weaknesses in memory as carefully as a scholar keeps notes. What they thought forgotten in the passing of years remained with him, sharp and alive. There were moments when glimpses of this unnerved even the most hardened overseer. They spoke of his calmness under punishment, how he neither begged nor cursed, how his eyes remained steady even as his body bled. One overseer swore that when he raised his whip, Solomon stared at him in a way that made his hand falter for just a second, a look not of fear, but of judgment, as though Solomon were measuring him, as though the roles were reversed and it was the overseer who stood naked before an unseen power. The story was laughed off in daylight, dismissed as foolishness. But at night, when drink loosened tongues, men admitted that there was something about Solomon they could not quite master. His legend grew in quiet corners. Among the enslaved, he was not simply another victim. He became a vessel of their unspoken rage, their buried hopes. They spoke of him as someone who carried their suffering with him, who could perhaps do what others only dreamed of: strike back. They did not say this loudly. Such talk could mean death. But the whispers traveled nonetheless, like smoke curling unseen into the rafters. Solomon himself did not spread these tales. He never claimed to be more than he was. But the aura around him thickened with each passing year, until even his silence seemed dangerous. The 9 masters who passed him among themselves believed they were trading a possession. In truth, they were binding themselves together in a story none of them could foresee. Each added his cruelty to the ledger Solomon kept in his heart. Each carved another scar into his body. Each underestimated the endurance of a man who learned more from pain than they did from privilege. By the time he reached the last of them, Solomon carried within him not only his own suffering, but the collective memory of countless others. He had become a living archive of Charleston's cruelty, and like any archive, it waited for the moment it would be opened. What made Solomon different was not strength of body alone. Many men were strong. It was not simply endurance, though his surpassed most. What set him apart was the union of memory, patience, and a mind sharpened by observation. He watched the careless arrogance of the masters. He saw how they dismissed the earth beneath their feet, how they assumed ownership not only of people but of land, never suspecting that land could betray them. He knew their rhythms, their indulgences, their blind spots. To them he was invisible, a shadow in the background of their wealth. To him, they were etched in perfect clarity, each flaw waiting for the right moment to be exploited. In a world designed to crush identity, Solomon held on to something no lash could strip: purpose. He became the embodiment of quiet resistance, the reminder that even in chains, the mind could remain unbroken, and that patience, when sharpened by suffering, could become a weapon sharper than any blade. This was the man whose name survived not in official records but in whispers, a man whose presence made masters uneasy, and whose silence carried the weight of judgment. Solomon was not merely another figure in Charleston's endless parade of suffering. He was the shadow in the corner, the watchful eye, the quiet resolve that would one day ignite into legend. The cruelty of Charleston's 9 masters was not ordinary, even in a world where brutality was the foundation of power. Their reputations were whispered about in the quarters, muttered in hushed tones that carried across plantations, because their deeds crossed a line that even other slaveholders privately acknowledged with unease. Each of these men wore fine clothes and spoke of honor at dinner tables, but beneath the polish of manners lived appetites that revealed themselves in violence, in the breaking of bodies, in acts that left scars deeper than flesh. They did not simply enforce slavery. They gloried in its cruelty, turning suffering into a form of entertainment, into ritual, into proof of their dominance. One of them, a planter whose fields stretched endlessly with rice, was known for his punishments. He kept a pit dug behind his barn, filled it with water, and forced those who displeased him to crouch inside for hours, sometimes days, with only their heads above the surface. Mosquitoes swarmed the victims, the dampness sank into their bones, and when finally released, many never recovered. Another prided himself on his whip, a leather lash he named as though it were a prized stallion. He was said to carve marks into the wooden handle for every slave he broke beneath its strikes, and the handle itself bore more notches than anyone could count. There was the master who starved people deliberately, rationing food as a game, watching bodies waste away, satisfied not simply with obedience but with complete surrender, and the one who branded his initials into flesh, burning his mark as though human beings were cattle. One master forced mothers to watch as their children were beaten, claiming it taught both discipline and fear. Another was notorious for sending men into the rice fields during the height of summer heat, ignoring the fevers and deaths that followed as though they were nothing more than natural loss. Among them, cruelty was a form of bonding. Stories traded over wine at night, each man boasting of how far he had gone to maintain control, to prove superiority. They did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as guardians of order, protectors of a system that demanded pain as its currency. What made their brutality more grotesque was the hypocrisy woven through it. They prayed in church pews on Sunday mornings, their families dressed in fine clothing, heads bowed as hymns filled the air. They spoke of morality, of duty, of civilization. Their daughters learned to play instruments, their sons studied philosophy, and their wives wrote letters filled with reflections on Scripture. Yet once the prayers were over, they returned to their estates where screams echoed through the night. They could sit at a table and bless their food while knowing that the very hands serving them had been blistered raw only hours earlier. The contradiction was so complete that they no longer saw it as contradiction at all. Cruelty had become normal, sanctified, folded into the rhythms of daily life until it no longer pricked at conscience. The 9 masters existed in a society that rewarded such blindness. But even within that world, they stood apart, notorious for how far they allowed their darkness to stretch. For the enslaved who lived under them, life was a constant theater of terror. To wake each morning was to wonder not only what labor would demand, but what whims might erupt into violence. The unpredictability was part of the punishment. A task done well might still be met with blows if the master was drunk, if the day had been poor, if his mood soured for reasons unrelated to the work. To live in such conditions was to endure more than physical pain. It was to be stripped of stability, forced to dwell in a fog of constant dread. Yet within that dread, memory grew sharp. Every act of cruelty, every humiliation, every body broken under these 9 men carved itself into the collective memory of those who survived. And Solomon, passing from one master to the next, became the living witness who carried all their horrors within him. Their violence was not only against the enslaved, it poisoned their own households, their wives, their children. Stories told in secret spoke of daughters who flinched at their father's footsteps, of wives who retreated into illness, of sons raised in shadows of fear. The cruelty they practiced outwardly seeped inward, corroding whatever humanity they might have once possessed. Yet in public they were celebrated as pillars of Charleston society, men of wealth and importance, whose names appeared in ledgers and newspapers. Their reputations, polished and gilded, stood in direct opposition to the whispered truths known among the enslaved. The dissonance was staggering, but the city turned its face away. To acknowledge the reality would have been to admit that Charleston's wealth was inseparable from sadism. The enslaved kept count in silence. They knew which master had caused which death, which scar, which mutilation. They told stories of the one who forced men to dig their own graves and then left them empty, a form of psychological torture that haunted survivors for years. They remembered the overseer who was encouraged to hunt down runaways like prey, paid extra for every captured body, a sport that blurred the line between labor and bloodlust. These memories were not recorded in books. They were carried in whispers, in scars, in songs coded with meaning. And through those whispers a pattern emerged. 9 men whose cruelty was unmatched, whose names drew shivers when spoken after dark, whose presence loomed like storm clouds over the quarters. Solomon endured each of them in turn. Where others broke, he remembered. Where others fell into despair, he stored their stories, their pains, their humiliations. Each act of cruelty against him became part of a growing ledger, not of numbers, but of debts owed. His silence was not submission. It was the patience of someone collecting accounts, waiting for the day balance would be restored. The 9 masters thought themselves invincible, untouchable in their wealth and status, but in binding Solomon's life to their cruelty, they unknowingly bound their fates together. For every lash, every scar, every torment inflicted, Solomon added another weight to the scale, and he waited for the moment when it would tip. Their cruelty, grotesque even by the standards of the age, created the conditions for their own undoing. In their arrogance, they could not see that the man they thought broken was watching, remembering, and transforming pain into purpose. They could not imagine that their laughter over wine, their boasts of punishment, their rituals of dominance, were laying the foundation for a story that would outlive them all. For while Charleston preserved their names in wealth and titles, the enslaved preserved them in whispers as villains, as devils, as the 9 whose cruelty demanded an answer. And that answer, whispered in the darkness, was Solomon. The legend of Solomon's revenge begins not with fire or sudden rebellion, but with silence and patience. For years he endured the weight of cruelty, his body carrying scars that spoke louder than words, his mind recording each humiliation and act of violence. The 9 masters who had owned him never understood the danger of a man who watched, remembered, and learned. They mistook his quiet for submission, his endurance for brokenness. But in truth, every blow, every lash, every injustice was sharpening something within him. When the moment finally came, it was not born of rage alone, but of planning, of calculation, of a vision carried in the marrow of his bones, that the very earth, which had been forced to yield crops for his oppressors, could be turned into their tomb. Solomon's knowledge of the land was his greatest weapon. The rice fields and marshes of South Carolina were not simply places of toil to him. They were maps, shifting and alive, full of secrets that only those who worked them could understand. He knew where the soil held firm and where it crumbled, where the roots of trees bound earth together and where water hollowed out hidden cavities. Years of forced labor had taught him the weight of soil, the sound it made when it collapsed, the way tunnels could be shaped without drawing attention. What overseers saw as endless drudgery, Solomon saw as training. The land spoke to him and he listened. To others it was a prison. To him it was the instrument of justice. The method by which he lured the 9 men remains wrapped in mystery, with stories passed through whispers carrying different details. One account tells of a discovery, a rumor seated carefully by Solomon himself, a hidden stash of contraband, gold or rum buried beneath a barn, treasure that could not be claimed without the secrecy of the masters themselves. Another story insists that he led them one by one, offering information about runaways, pretending to betray his own people in exchange for mercy, guiding each into the darkness of tunnels he had prepared. A third version claims he orchestrated a gathering, convincing them that their wealth was threatened and that he knew of a way to protect it. In every telling, though, the constant remains. Solomon was the hand that guided them underground, and the soil itself was the weapon that swallowed them alive. Imagine the scene. A narrow shaft dug into the earth, torches flickering against damp walls, the smell of soil and sweat heavy in the air. 9 men descend, arrogant, certain of their control, mocking the very man who leads them. They believe themselves masters of all things, of land, of bodies, of fate. They cannot fathom that the earth beneath their boots has been prepared to betray them. Then a sound. Perhaps the crack of wood, perhaps the sudden groan of shifting soil, a moment of confusion. One of them shouts, another laughs nervously, and then the ground begins to give way. Darkness thickens as the tunnel folds inward, soil rushing like a wave, collapsing with merciless weight. Panic erupts. Torches fall and extinguish. Hands claw at dirt. Muffled screams rise. Men who commanded hundreds of lives reduced to blind animals scrambling for air. The earth, which they had plundered for profit, closes over them in silence. What makes the tale more haunting is that no bodies were ever recovered, at least not in the versions passed down among the enslaved. There were no funerals, no graves marked with stone. The 9 masters simply vanished, erased in a way that terrified those who remained. In Charleston, disappearance was not part of the narrative. Masters were supposed to die in beds, surrounded by family, their legacies preserved in ledgers and portraits. To vanish into the soil without ceremony was unthinkable. Yet that was the essence of Solomon's revenge, to strip them of the dignity they denied others, to deny them the recognition they believed was their birthright. They became nothing more than whispers, their names carried in fear rather than respect, their wealth unable to shield them from the justice of earth itself. Among the enslaved, the story spread like fire through dry grass, not in open defiance but in secret murmurs exchanged at night. The image of masters buried alive became more than an act of vengeance. It was a myth of possibility. It told them that the system was not invincible, that even the most powerful could be dragged into the same dirt they forced others to till. Children listened wide-eyed as elders recounted the tale, their fear tempered with a strange, dangerous hope. For once, the enslaved had a story in which the master was not the victor, but the victim. For once, the balance of power had shifted, even if only in whispers, but the story also bred terror among the planters. Rumors spread quickly in Charleston's parlors, each version more elaborate than the last. Some insisted Solomon had used poison, others claimed witchcraft, invoking African spirits to pull the men into the earth. Fear, once confined to the enslaved, now crept into the drawing rooms of the wealthy. Masters began to look over their shoulders, their laughter less certain, their arrogance tempered with unease. If 9 men could vanish without explanation, who was safe? If the earth itself could be turned against them, what protection could wealth and power offer? The idea was more frightening than any armed rebellion because it was invisible, silent, a threat that might already be under their feet. What happened to Solomon after the act remains the deepest mystery of all. Some claimed he escaped into the swamps, vanishing like the men he buried, his body never found. Others swore he was captured, tortured, and executed in secret, his death hidden to prevent him from becoming a martyr. A few insisted he lived on, moving from place to place under false names, always watching, always waiting. In every version, though, the masters tried to erase him, just as they tried to erase what he had done. No official records mention 9 planters vanishing. No newspaper articles report the event. It exists only in the cracks, in the memories carried by those who were never meant to speak, in the stories dismissed by historians as rumor. Yet the method of his revenge remains unforgettable. It was not with fire, not with blade, not with poison, but with the very soil of Charleston. The land, soaked with sweat and blood, became the executioner. In doing so, Solomon achieved something extraordinary. He turned the tools of oppression into instruments of justice. The fields that had enslaved thousands became the graves of those who profited from them. The earth, indifferent and eternal, became the silent witness to a reversal no one dared to acknowledge openly. The method was as poetic as it was horrifying, leaving behind a story too dangerous to be written but too powerful to be forgotten. The whispers of what happened in Charleston did not emerge in the streets first, but in the kitchens, in the slave quarters, in the whispered lullabies sung low enough to keep white ears from hearing. It was not a story anyone could afford to tell in daylight. 9 men gone, swallowed not by illness or accident, but by something so deliberate, so unimaginable, that the very soil beneath Charleston was said to still breathe with their terror. The record books were silent, the newspapers cautious. the courts conveniently blind. And yet, the story of the 9 masters who vanished, buried alive in an act of unspeakable vengeance, lingered like smoke in the air, daring anyone to ask what really happened. The act itself became the core mystery, a forbidden truth carefully smothered to protect the illusion of order. But order in Charleston was a mask stretched thin, hiding the rot of cruelty that had been building for generations. The very method of vengeance, being buried alive, spoke of something more than rage. It carried a symbolism that pierced through the surface of revenge and into ritual, into meaning. To bury a man alive is not simply to kill him, but to return him to the earth before his time, to smother his cries in the same soil that his slaves had tilled, watered with sweat and blood. Each shovelful of dirt was not just execution, but a curse, a reversal of power, and that reversal terrified the ruling class more than the act itself. To admit it had happened meant acknowledging that their slaves had not only resisted but struck fear deep into the heart of the system. So the mystery was born not just from what happened but from the silence that followed. A silence as carefully constructed as the graves themselves. The exact number, 9, hung over Charleston like a phantom tally. 9 men who had owned land, influence, and human lives. 9 voices that had commanded obedience, now silenced beneath the ground. Why 9? Was it chance, a matter of opportunity, or was it deliberate? Did Solomon count them, choosing each as a symbol, each burial a mark against the system that had enslaved him? Questions multiplied because the answers had been buried with them. Records were vague, witnesses hushed. Some said the men were lured to an isolated plantation under the cover of night, tied and forced into pits dug in advance. Others whispered that it was done one by one, each master trapped and silenced in secret until the total reached 9. Both versions made sense. Both versions carried the same horror, that men who had lived with power died stripped of it, clawing at earth, their shouts unheard or ignored. The very idea that one man, Solomon, could orchestrate such a calculated and terrifying series of deaths was almost unthinkable to white Charleston society. To them, slaves were supposed to be docile, broken, incapable of such defiance. But the story challenged that illusion, suggesting intelligence, planning, and a sense of justice that mirrored the cruelty of the slave system back onto itself. That was perhaps the most dangerous part of the mystery. If one slave could imagine this, how many others dreamed of it in silence? How many could turn dream into action? By erasing the story, they thought they could erase the possibility. Yet the whispers persisted, passed like an ember from one mouth to another, never fully extinguished. Even today, historians struggle to separate truth from legend. Some trace faint mentions of missing men in Charleston records, unexplained disappearances that were attributed to accidents or travel. Others point to inconsistencies in estate transfers and wills around that time, as though heirs were forced to quickly cover unexplained deaths. But hard evidence is scarce, deliberately erased or never written down at all. This absence itself speaks volumes. Slave uprisings, no matter how small, were almost always documented, sensationalized in newspapers as cautionary tales to remind both slaves and owners of the consequences. But here silence. No headlines, no trials, no executions made into spectacles. Instead, a void, one that suggests fear not of the act, but of the idea spreading. Better to bury the story along with the bodies than risk inspiring others. The physical act of burying men alive created imagery too chilling to ignore. Imagine the sound of the soil hitting their faces, muffling their cries, the desperation of fingernails clawing at earth in vain. It was a fate worse than hanging, worse than shooting, slow, suffocating, and humiliating. It forced them to feel powerlessness, the same suffocating helplessness that enslaved people felt every day. And in that cruel mirror, a deeper kind of vengeance was achieved. Their last moments were not of dominance, but of panic, of pleading, of being rendered insignificant against the weight of dirt and silence. That inversion of roles may be why the story endured in whispers. It was more than just killing. It was a rewriting of hierarchy in the most brutal way imaginable. Of course, such an act demanded secrecy. To accomplish it without immediate retribution, there must have been complicity, or at least silence from others who knew. Some slaves may have helped dig, others may have turned away knowingly, understanding the risk but honoring the cause. White society, however, chose silence of another kind. If family members of the 9 knew what happened, they never spoke it aloud in public records. To admit their kin had been overpowered by a slave was unthinkable, a stain too deep to acknowledge. So they told themselves and others that the men had traveled, drowned, or simply vanished, leaving the real story to decay underground. But human silence is never perfect. A wife confides to a sister, a child overhears, a whisper escapes in a kitchen at night. Over time, fragments pieced themselves into a tale so disturbing it refused to stay dead. This mystery also exposes how history itself is curated, shaped not by what happened, but by what was allowed to be remembered. If Solomon truly buried 9 masters alive, he carved a mark into Charleston that official records desperately tried to erase. And yet, erasure itself becomes evidence. Why else would so little be written, so few questions asked about so many influential men disappearing? Why else would their absence be smoothed over so quickly? The silences, the gaps, the deliberate avoidance, they point to something people were too afraid to confront. It is in these absences that Solomon's revenge becomes not just a story of murder, but a story of truth hidden in plain sight. The buried bodies may never be found, but the buried history seeps through, haunting the city even now. Charleston was a city built on silence. The streets bustled with wealth, powdered wigs, carriages, and the fragrance of imported tobacco, but beneath that surface lay a constant hum of fear. White society prided itself on civility, on the illusion of control, yet every planter, every merchant, every judge knew the numbers. There were more enslaved Africans in Charleston than free whites. It was a city teetering on a knife's edge, where the enslaved outnumbered the enslavers, and that imbalance haunted the minds of those who benefited most from it. They lived surrounded by the very people they oppressed, and the thought of rebellion lingered in every creak of the floorboards at night, in every flicker of a candle guttering out. It was not if resistance would come, but when. That is why whispers of Solomon's revenge could not be tolerated. To speak them aloud was to acknowledge that the system was not invincible, that it could crack, and if it cracked, it could shatter. The preservation of order in Charleston required more than chains and overseers. It required control of information. Stories of uprisings in Haiti, of revolts in Virginia, of plots discovered in Louisiana were passed among enslaved people like fuel on a fire. Each tale carried possibility, proof that the enslavers were not gods but men, and men could bleed. So when 9 masters in Charleston were rumored to have been buried alive, the danger was not just the act itself but the contagious power of the story. Silence became the weapon of choice. The white elite smothered the tale in legal erasures and polite avoidance, while the enslaved carried it forward in half-spoken warnings and veiled references, ensuring the truth survived even as the city tried to bury it. There was strategy in how Charleston managed its silence. Newspapers that might have reported the disappearances instead shifted focus to trade, to distant political debates, to anything but the void left by 9 vanished men. Courts that should have probed estates and questioned inheritances processed them with haste, leaving only faint traces of irregularity. Families whose patriarchs had supposedly traveled or died quietly arranged their affairs, never pressing for public investigations. The absence of official acknowledgement was itself a kind of choreography, an agreement that it was better to pretend nothing had happened than to risk pulling on a thread that might unravel the entire fabric of slavery. If the public believed 9 men could be overpowered and entombed by those they had owned, the fear that already haunted Charleston would become unmanageable. And yet, silence is never absolute. The enslaved were the witnesses, the gravediggers of truth. They carried fragments of the story, sometimes in coded songs, sometimes in stories told to children while husking corn at night. They did not speak Solomon's name openly, but they remembered what he had done. They passed down the image of masters clawing at dirt, suffocating under the weight of the earth as a grim kind of justice. For the enslaved, the story was not only about fear, it was about hope. Proof that the system could be defied, that vengeance was possible even against those who believed themselves untouchable. In that sense, silence became dual. For the white elite, silence meant erasure. For the enslaved, silence meant preservation, keeping the memory alive where it could not be easily destroyed. This dual silence created a strange afterlife for Solomon's revenge. No one could point to records, no historian could cite a trial, but the absence itself was damning. It mirrored the way Charleston treated the enslaved in life, reducing them to entries on plantation ledgers, counting them not as human beings but as property, their names and stories erased unless preserved orally. The masters who vanished shared, in the end, that same fate of erasure. Their names were swallowed by silence, their power rendered meaningless by the soil that covered them. For once, the silence that had erased thousands of enslaved lives turned inward, consuming those who had wielded it. But silence also left shadows, and shadows bred fear. Even if the story was never printed in papers, it slipped through Charleston like smoke. White families whispered it in drawing rooms, careful to keep their voices low, wondering which of their peers had truly vanished and whether the same fate could befall them. Some claimed to hear scratching sounds in the earth at night, the restless clawing of the 9 men seeking to dig their way back. Superstitions grew. Never walk alone by the marshes at dusk, never ignore the sound of shifting dirt in the garden. Silence did not erase the fear. It magnified it, made it spectral, a haunting no one could openly name. For the enslaved, the silence had a different weight. It was both shield and burden. To speak too loudly of Solomon was to risk death, but to remain silent entirely would mean letting the story vanish. So they spoke carefully, wrapping memory in allegory. Children were told tales of the earth swallowing cruel men whole, of soil that could remember pain and repay it. Songs carried double meanings, lyrics about burial and freedom interwoven, so that only those who knew could understand. In this way, the silence Charleston imposed was never complete. It was porous, leaking meaning into every corner where enslaved people gathered. The mystery lived because silence could never fully contain it. Charleston itself became complicit in the burial, not just of men but of truth. The city prided itself on being a bastion of Southern elegance, a jewel of the slave economy, and such an atrocity threatened to stain its carefully polished image. To admit that 9 masters had been buried alive was to admit weakness, chaos, and the possibility of rebellion bubbling just beneath the surface. So Charleston buried the story alongside the bodies, choosing the safety of ignorance over the risk of truth. This selective silence shaped not only the city's history but its identity, teaching future generations to look away from what unsettled, to value order over honesty. And yet, centuries later, the silence itself speaks. The gaps in the record, the erasures in the newspapers, the sudden vanishings in estate documents, they are louder than words. They suggest that something happened too dangerous to name, something so destabilizing that it could not be allowed to exist in the public eye. That is the paradox of silence in Charleston. The more they tried to bury the truth, the more its shadow grew, until it lingered over the city like an unmarked grave. The soil may never give up its secrets, but the silence ensures that the question will never die. What really happened to those 9 men? And why does Charleston still tremble at the thought of answering? The soil of Charleston holds more than bones. It holds memory, though not the kind written in neat lines of ink. Official history chose its silence, but the enslaved carried the weight of what happened in their bodies, in their voices, in the rhythms of words spoken when no overseer lingered nearby. What Solomon had done could not be shouted in the open streets, but neither could it be forgotten. It survived in the cadence of stories told by firelight, in the way mothers rocked their children with lullabies that seemed simple but carried a coded edge, in the pauses that lingered when men spoke about justice late at night. Oral tradition became the grave marker, the witness stand, and the archive for an act that no paper dared record. When elders spoke of the earth itself taking vengeance, of cruel men swallowed into pits of dirt, they were not speaking in abstractions. They were recalling Solomon's act in the only safe language left to them, metaphor that lived as truth for those who understood. Children would hear these stories and, at first, think them parables, until age and whispered explanation revealed their hidden layers. The ground remembers, one elder might say while hoeing the rows of cotton, and the child would think of soil as dirt. Years later, that same child would remember the phrase and know that the ground was also a grave, a silent accomplice to vengeance. In this way, Solomon's revenge lived on, not as a clean narrative, but as a presence woven into daily speech. Songs, too, became carriers of memory. Work songs in the fields, with their call and response, layered meaning beneath rhythm. A line about digging might on the surface reflect labor in the earth, but to those who knew, it echoed the digging of pits where masters had been lowered alive. A verse about silence might seem to be about the quiet of the night, But to those initiated, it was about the silence Charleston forced over the truth. To the untrained ear, they were harmless. To those who shared in the memory, they were reminders, affirmations, that the story lived even when suppressed. The danger of speaking openly demanded this art of concealment, and it ensured that the memory was never erased, only transformed. Generations passed, and with them, the story shifted, as oral traditions always do. Some said Solomon worked alone, others claimed he had many helpers, and still others believed the very earth rose up to aid him. The act itself became mythologized, stretching beyond human vengeance into the realm of the supernatural. This was not a distortion, but a survival strategy. By cloaking Solomon's revenge in myth, the enslaved made it untouchable, something no overseer could punish because it could not be proven as fact. And yet, in that myth, the essence remained. The oppressed could strike back, and the mighty could fall. The story's shape might bend, but its power endured. There were moments when the story resurfaced in sharper form, when whispers grew too loud to ignore. After the planned Denmark-Vesey revolt in 1822, Charleston authorities grew paranoid about slave communication. They scoured letters, interrogated informants, tried to stamp out conspiracies. In their panic, some officials recorded fears of unspeakable acts committed in silence, phrases so vague yet telling. Though they never named Solomon, one can hear the echo of his revenge in their dread. The story had lived long enough, moved quietly enough, that even white society, in its nightmares, began to sense its outlines. Fear of what had already happened became fuel for the terror of what might happen again. Even after emancipation, when the chains were broken but the scars remained, Solomon's story carried forward. Freedmen and their descendants spoke of it as proof that resistance had always been possible, that courage did not begin with the Union Army, but had lived in the hearts of the enslaved long before. Families passed the tale down not as entertainment but as inheritance, a reminder of what their blood had endured and what it had achieved in shadows. In some tellings, Solomon was not merely a man, but a symbol of all who resisted, his story merging with countless others who had fought in ways large and small. By then, whether or not every detail was historically accurate no longer mattered. What mattered was that it had meaning, that it gave voice to centuries of silenced rage. There is a reason legends outlast documents. Paper burns, ink fades, records can be doctored or destroyed. Oral tradition resists that erasure precisely because it lives in people, in voices that move from one generation to the next. The white planters of Charleston thought they had buried the truth along with the men in the ground, but they underestimated memory's persistence. The story of Solomon's revenge is proof that silence is never absolute. What is buried can still breathe. What is hidden can still echo. Even in the absence of records, the story survived because it belonged to the people who had the most to lose if it disappeared. As time passed and Charleston reinvented itself as a city of charm and history, the official tours and museums rarely spoke of Solomon. They preferred to highlight architecture, trade, and polite society, leaving the darker currents unmentioned. Yet, just beyond those curated narratives, the story continued to ripple, whispered in black communities, carried in fragments, waiting for those willing to listen. It became a kind of ghost story, not just of men buried alive, but of truth buried under silence. Visitors might admire the grandeur of the city, but those who knew the story saw the soil differently. Every step carried the weight of what had been hidden beneath it. To this day, the mystery lingers not only because of what was done, but because of how it was remembered. Oral tradition did not preserve Solomon's act as a neat chapter in history. It preserved it as atmosphere, as tension, as a haunting that lives in language and rhythm. That is why the story still has power. It was never fully written down, never caged by the limits of paper. It lived instead in the human imagination, where it could grow, adapt, and resist forgetting. Solomon's revenge may never be proven by documents, but its survival in memory is itself a victory. A reminder that some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how much earth is thrown over them. What you've just heard is not the kind of history they want in school books. It isn't neat, it isn't comfortable, and it doesn't fit inside the polished story Charleston likes to tell about itself. But these are the shadows that matter, the whispers that survived when paper and ink chose silence. Stories like Solomon's Revenge force us to confront the buried truths, the ones that change how we see the past, and ourselves. If this story left you unsettled, If it made you question what else has been erased, then this channel is where you belong. We don't chase the polished versions of history. We pull back the curtain on the parts you were never meant to know. Every week we dig deeper into forbidden history, dark mysteries, and the echoes of lives written out of the official record. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe Solomon's revenge was real, a piece of history deliberately erased? Or has it become something larger, an immortal legend that speaks louder than fact? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective matters because these stories are more than history. They're conversation, a reckoning with the past that lives in all of us. And if you want more stories of secrets, silence, and survival, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Join a growing community that refuses to look away from the darkness, because sometimes what's buried is exactly what we need to uncover. Subscribe, comment, and keep the story alive.